Okay, just imagine this for a second. You have a sacred text, a record supposedly written by the biblical patriarch Abraham himself that was thought to be lost for thousands of years. Then, boom, it suddenly reappears in 19th century America. I mean, you've got to admit, it sounds like something straight out of an Indiana Jones movie, right? But for millions of people, this is the very real origin story of a foundational piece of their scripture. So today, let's unpack the incredible and incredibly controversial journey of the Book of Abraham. And this is the absolutely incredible claim at the heart of it all. It comes from Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement. He didn't just suggest this, he declared that he had acquired and translated an ancient Egyptian papyrus that contained the actual, literal writings of Abraham written by his own hand. But here's the massive question, the one that really sets this whole thing on fire. What if that original papyrus was found? And what if it said something completely, totally different? You know, that single question, it ignites one of the most fascinating and, frankly, contentious debates in all of modern religious history. Suddenly, you've got faith on one side, academic consensus on the other, and this ancient scroll becomes a modern-day theological battleground. All right, so to really get a grip on this controversy, we've got to go back to the beginning. We need to understand the journey of this pretty remarkable document. I mean, how on earth did an ancient Egyptian papyrus end up in Ohio and become a sacred text? Let's find out. So, the story kicks off way back in 1835. Joseph Smith buys a few mummies and some ancient scrolls from a guy with a traveling exhibition. Right away, he starts what he calls a translation of one of them, which he identifies as the Book of Abraham, and it gets published in 1842, and then, poof! For more than 100 years, everyone just assumes the original papyri are gone for good, probably burned up in the Great Chicago Fire. But then, in 1966, the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Yeah, this is where everything changed. A key piece of evidence, something everyone thought was lost to history, just reappears. And this, right here, is where the modern debate really truly begins. And you are not going to believe this twist. A portion of the original Joseph Smith papyri was found just sitting in the archives of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The Met then gave these fragments to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and just like that, for the very first time, the actual source material for the Book of Abraham could be examined by independent experts. And this was it. This was the million-dollar question, right? I mean, by this point, the Rosetta Stone had unlocked the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphics for decades. Scholars could now just read the papyri directly. So, would their findings back up what Joseph Smith said? Or would they reveal something else entirely? So the Egyptologists got to work. And well, it didn't take long at all for some really serious problems to emerge for the traditional story. And what's interesting is that the first red flags weren't even in the hieroglyphics themselves. They were actually in the English text that Joseph Smith produced. Scholars started noticing some historical inconsistencies. You know, things that just seemed completely out of place in time. We're talking about something called an anachronism. And all that is basically a historical error. It's like if you were watching a movie set in ancient Rome and you saw one of the characters pull out a smartphone. It just doesn't fit the time period. It's a dead giveaway that something's not right. And a really clear example of this is right there in the very first verse of the Book of Abraham. It says, Abraham is in the land of the Chaldeans. Okay, what's the problem? Well, historians and archaeologists are pretty much all in agreement that the Chaldean civilization didn't even rise to prominence until more than 1,000 years after Abraham would have lived. But look, as big a deal as those anachronisms were, they kind of took a backseat to the main event, the central issue. What did the Egyptian text on those rediscovered papyri actually say? And when you put the two translations side by side, wow, the contrast is just stark. I mean, Joseph Smith's version starts this epic story of Abraham, but the Egyptologists, they looked at it and said, nope, this is a pretty common funeral document. It's known as a Book of Breathing, which was basically a scroll with spells to help a dead guy named Hor get to the afterlife. There's no mention of Abraham, no mention of any of the events from his book. Nothing. And it wasn't just the text either. The problems extended to the illustrations, which are called facsimiles. For instance, Joseph Smith identified this image, called Facsimile 1, as a scene of Abraham about to be sacrificed. But any Egyptologist would look at that and immediately recognize it as a standard Egyptian funeral scene. That's the jackal-headed god Anubis preparing the body of the deceased god of Cyrus on an embalming table. The two interpretations, they're not even in the same ballpark. So, okay, you've got this absolutely massive gap between the physical evidence, the papyrus, and the scriptural text. So the big question is, how do believers and scholars within the faith explain this? Well, this brings us to a field of study called apologetics. It's all about providing reasoned arguments to defend religious beliefs when they face questions or criticism. And in this case, Latter-day Saint apologists have come up with a few key explanations. Okay, so there are two main theories that you'll hear most often. The first one is the missing scroll theory. This idea suggests that the fragments we have now, they're just from the wrong scroll. The real Book of Abraham was on a much longer scroll that is, unfortunately, still lost. Then you have the catalyst theory. This one argues that the papyri weren't meant to be a literal translation at all. Instead, they were more like a spiritual trigger or a catalyst that helped Joseph Smith receive the text as a direct revelation from God. But here's the thing. Critics of both of those theories point right back to Joseph Smith's own records. His personal journals say over and over again that he was translating the characters. And even more directly, some of his translation notes have survived, and they literally show specific hieroglyphs from the papyrus fragments we do have, copied right next to the English text of the Book of Abraham. This really suggests he was attempting a direct character-by-character translation. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, this is all a really interesting academic debate about an ancient text, but it's so much more than that. The Book of Abraham has a truly profound and lasting impact on the core doctrines of the Church and on the personal faith of its members. You see, for Latter-day Saints, this book isn't just some optional extra. It's the absolute scriptural bedrock for one of their most unique and central beliefs, the idea of a pre-mortal existence. This is the teaching that all of us lived as spirits with God before we were born. It shapes their entire understanding of who we are and why we're here. So the authenticity of this book is tied directly to the very core of their faith. And on the flip side, for some people, really digging into this evidence becomes the breaking point. The inconsistencies between the papyri and the scripture just become too much. It leads them to question the foundational claims of Joseph Smith himself and, for many, their entire faith. And this really brings home the human side of the controversy. For a lot of former members, we're not just talking about history or linguistics here. This becomes a deeply personal journey that can completely redefine their identity, their family relationships, and their entire worldview, sometimes after a whole lifetime of belief. So in the end, this whole conflict brings up a much bigger, more profound question that goes way beyond just this one book. It really forces us to ask about the nature of Scripture and faith itself. Where does spiritual truth come from? Is it found in verifiable history? Is it found in divine revelation? Or is it somewhere in between? And maybe the biggest question of all is, what happens when those two things seem to be in a head-on collision?